So, what would it actually take for the US to launch a military strike on Venezuela? I know it sounds pretty unthinkable, right? But this isn't some wild guess. It's actually a super detailed war game, a scenario cooked up by policy experts at Chatham House. They wanted to see what the extreme outcomes of American foreign policy could look like. And today, we're going to break down exactly how this whole thing could unfold, step by step. Okay, just picture this. You wake up on January 3rd, 2026, and this is the headline. Now, of course, this is a fictional statement, but it's the explosive ending to this expert war game. The president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, has been captured by U.S. forces. I mean, can you even imagine? The entire world would be just stunned. So the real question here isn't just what happened. It's how in the world did we get here?
Yeah, exactly. How did it come to this? To even begin to understand an operation like this in 2026, we've got to jump in a time machine and rewind the clock. We need to look at the chain of events, the policy decisions that could lead from, just diplomatic pressure to all-out military action. And believe it or not, it all starts way back in 2020.
All right, so we're talking about the art of sanctions, a policy of pressure. You see, long before anyone was even whispering about military strikes, the main weapon in the U.S. playbook was economic. So to really get a grip on this dramatic shift to using force, we first have to understand the policy of sanctions. And for that, we're leaning on some great analysis from Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. So think back to 2020. The U.S. government was in a really tough spot. You've got Venezuela's regime, which they saw as hostile and totally mismanaged. A full-on invasion? No way. That was off the table. But at the same time, diplomacy just wasn't working. So what do? This is that classic situation where policymakers go, okay, time to pull out the sanctions playbook. And look, this wasn't just about throwing random economic punches. The policy actually followed a really specific framework, which is detailed in Richard Nephew's book, The Art of Sanctions. It's a surprisingly methodical process, right? You start by identifying your objectives, then you really try to understand your target's weak spots, you develop a strategy, you monitor how it's going, and you even have to explain how the sanctions can eventually be lifted. It's basically statecraft designed to cause just enough pain to get what you want, all without firing a single bullet. So what was the stated goal of all this? Pretty straightforward, really. Get Nicolás Maduro to step aside for a peaceful, democratic transition. That was the bullseye they were aiming for. But the reality on the ground? It was like hitting a brick wall. The Maduro regime and its military support base were just formidable. They were deeply dug in. So the idea that just economic pressure alone was going to make them throw up their hands and give up power? Well, according to this analysis, that was a huge miscalculation. Okay, on to Operation Southern Spear, the path to escalation. So if economic pressure isn't getting the job done, what's next? Well, this is where our hypothetical scenario takes a really dramatic and, frankly, violent turn. It escalates from a policy of pressure to a full-blown campaign of force. And this brings us to something called Operation Southern Spear. Now, that's the fictional name for what's described as a counter-narco-terrorism campaign that kicks off in late 2025. And pay attention to that language because it's super important. The public reason for this isn't about democracy anymore. It's about fighting narco-terrorists. And that's a really powerful shift, right? It gives a whole new legal and public justification for military action. And just look at how fast things spiral completely out of control. This timeline, which we've pulled from the source material, it's just breathtaking. It all starts in September 2025 with just one airstrike on a vessel at sea. By October, there are multiple strikes. In November, the operation gets its official name. And then, on Christmas Eve, the first strike hits a land target inside Venezuela. And then just 10 days later, it all culminates in Operation Absolute Resolve, and Maduro is captured. It's an incredibly rapid escalation. So what was the human cost of that final push? Well, according to the sources in this scenario, the strikes for Operation Absolute Resolve left more than 40 people dead. It was a swift, decisive action for sure, but one that came with a very, very real price in human lives. Now for the fallout. The world reacts, fallout, and fractures. Okay, so Maduro's been captured, the immediate U.S. objective has been met. But the story's far from over. The global reaction is immediate, it's severe, and it basically cracks the international community right in two. Now, in the region, support for what the U.S. did was, well, it was mixed. For instance, the fictional Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago is quoted with this really visceral statement, and it kind of highlights the deep frustration in parts of the Caribbean with all the drug-fueled gang violence. From that point of view,
Any action against traffickers was a welcome one, no matter who was taking it.
But you jump across the Atlantic, and the reaction couldn't be more different. It was swift and total condemnation. The French foreign minister, really speaking for a lot of Europe, says flat out that the U.S. strikes disregard international law. And just like that, you've got a massive diplomatic crisis on your hands.
And this throws us right into the legal minefield that the U.S. has just walked into. Professor Mark Weller's analysis for Chatham House is, frankly, devastating. I mean, look at the justifications the U.S. is giving: fighting the drug trade, going after a criminal government, even intervening for democracy. According to this analysis, none of those actually hold up under international law. And the last one, the claim of self-defense, is called spurious, which, by the way, is the exact same justification that the world rejected when the U.S. invaded Panama back in 1989. Okay, so you'd think that a military operation in a major oil-producing nation like Venezuela would send the markets into a total tailspin, right? But the financial analysts in this scenario point to something really surprising. While Venezuela has these massive oil reserves, its actual daily production was just a tiny drop in the global bucket. We're talking about 1.1 million barrels a day in a global market of 100 million. So the big takeaway here is this: the geopolitical shock is huge, but the immediate hit to oil prices is surprisingly small. All right, our final section, a new forever war, the unforeseen entanglement. You know, capturing a leader is often the easy part. It's the beginning of a new problem, not the end of an old one. And this brings us to the last, really haunting question that the experts in this scenario raise. What happens now? Did the United States just stumble into another forever war? And right away, the analysis points to all these cautionary tales from recent history. You've got insufficient planning, unclear objectives, no diplomats on the ground to manage the situation, unrealistic timelines. I mean, does any of this sound familiar? These aren't new problems. They are the exact same mistakes that plagued the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. And despite all that, the U.S. vows to stay until a proper transition can happen. But what does that even mean? It is a dangerously vague promise. There are no clear benchmarks, no timeline, no endgame. It's just the perfect recipe for mission creep, for getting stuck. The final word from Laurel Rapp of Chatham House is just chilling. This action, she writes, risks embroiling the United States in a major entanglement. So what started as this quick surgical operation is now looking like the beginning of a long, messy, and incredibly costly occupation. And that's where this whole war game leaves us, with a really critical question. The sanctions didn't work. The military strike did, at least in the short term. But in achieving that one goal, it might have opened a Pandora's box, a potentially endless entanglement. So it really forces us all to ask, when economic pressure just isn't enough, what are the true costs of using force?